There we go. Now we are. See, the moment I start to sing, that's when everything starts, that's when it starts coming on. So, let's go ahead and start getting to our seats, and we'll start class in a second. So, as you can tell, I am not the guest speaker. If you did not read your email or didn't happen to see your email, our guest speaker for today had to cancel. He had some medical testing or something down in Springfield and was unable to make it. So, as I was mentioning just a second ago, for those before the microphone came on, this is a portion of the class that we are going to be moving into. Got to get rid of my keys. So we're going to be talking about the land and the agriculture and the climate, growing areas of Israel from the historical archaeological perspective. This is really kind of more broad in general because this is a very specialized area of anthropology, archaeology, and changes in flora and fauna and climate and growing areas don't really change a whole lot. So there's not really a big difference for, say, 1000 BCE to 400 BCE from the agricultural perspective, but it's important for us to understand how that's important to the Judeans and why it was important. There's a lot of archaeological evidence, and I'm going to apologize. I'm going to do more talking than slides. The slides I'm going to be providing today, like I said, I wasn't prepared to present until Friday when I was notified by Charlie. So it's kind of a piecemeal. There's some pictures that I do want to include in this slideshow that I haven't added. Basically, some of the produce, some of the agricultural products and things that we'll talk about once we get into it. Before we begin, obviously, we start class with a small prayer, short prayer. Is there anybody who is needing prayers this morning other than our announcements? Not seeing anybody. Let's bow our heads. Holy God, we thank you so much for this beautiful day. We thank you for the seasons, this cold that indicates that the hope of spring and the warmth and the growth that will be coming forward. All things are through you, and seasons and times are controlled by your will. We thank you so much for the love of your Son and yourself and the Holy Spirit that was poured out at the cross. We ask that you help us to be mindful of that when we encounter others, that you be with those who are in our bulletins and in our minds and our hearts, those who we can't bring to mind, but we lift them up in prayer, and we ask that you watch over them and that you protect them and guide them and give them those things that you see fit, not that we wish for. Lord God, we thank you for your word and for all the things you've created, and help us to be mindful and open-minded to understand your creation better. We pray this in all things through Christ our Lord. Amen. So like I said last week, I was going to start reading from some of the non-canonical texts just so we get a perspective of what the Jews were doing, what they were writing, what they were thinking about during that period that we call intertestamental, which is where we don't have any canonical writings, which is about 300, 400 years. I'm going to be reading from a book called Ecclesiasticus. It's also known as the Wisdom of Yeshua ben Sirach, the wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach. And if you're not familiar, Jesus was actually a common name, and it's actually not Jesus. It's a Greek translation of Joshua, which is, or Josiah, or Joshua. So this is a completely different Jesus. This is written somewhere. This is one of the few books that we actually have that we can almost positively date. So it's written in intertestamental period about 197 BCE. It is written by and I was reading the notes earlier. I apologize, I didn't bring my glasses. So it is the longest of the wisdom books, so it's the longest of the apocryphal books. I believe it has 50-some chapters. I'll get you the actual number. 51 chapters. It's written sometime between 196 and 175. And Ben Sira, who's that's the guy's name as well. Ben Sira, it was translated by Ben Sira's grandson into Koine Greek, and he added a prologue sometime around 117 BCE. The prologue is generally considered to be the earliest witness to a tripartite canon of the books of the Hebrew Bible. The fact that the text in its prologue can be so precisely dated has great implications for the development of the Hebrew Bible canon. So this is the prologue. I'm only going to read, there's, I think, 31 verses, 32 verses. I'm just going to read the first 14. The prologue of Ecclesiasticus. Many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them. And for these we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. Now those who read them must not only themselves understand them, but also must, as lovers of learning, be able, through both speaking and writing, to help the outsiders. So my grandfather, Yesus, who had developed himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors, and had acquired considerable proficiency in them, was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, so that by becoming familiar also with his book, those who love learning might make even greater progress in living according to the law. So, we have a writing written about around 200 BCE. The prologue itself is written about 75, 80 years later, and it is a wisdom book. So if you've read the Book of Solomon, or you've read the Psalms, Proverbs, this is that type of book. So it gives advice, general advice to how to be a better Hebrew, a better Jew, and how to follow the law and what's expected of you. So again, there's still writing that we don't consider canonical, but that writing is again, I'm going to be talking about this a lot, this intertestamental period where we've always considered, many people have considered, for the longest time I considered, was just without any writings or any progress. There really is some progress, not progress, but there's continued writing, there's continued attempts to develop a canon, a form of worship, a means of worship to the God of Israel. So, can we dim the lights a little bit, please? Because I know people have trouble. So I'm going to start off, and we're going to talk about the ag and the culture, and we're going to be doing that for a couple of weeks. But I'm going to start off here because I think it's important for us to understand this is pre-exilic. So this is even before the exile. This is like 250 years before the exile, before the Assyrians destroy the northern tribes. And what I really want to point out is the relevant period that we are going to be talking about, and I've got another map that we'll get to next that shows just the area that we're talking about. We're talking about Benjamin, Judah, and what most people don't include is Simeon. According to the ancient maps, Simeon was actually inside Judah. Simeon was not part of Judah, so that when the kingships separated, and you have the line of David, and you have the line of northern kings. Simeon's leadership fell in line with the northern tribes. However, the people themselves were just like Judeans, or Judeans. They lived with the Judites. They interacted with Judites. They were part of this community. So when we talk about the 10 lost tribes, we're really kind of talking, and again, as I've said before, people from the north, as far up as Asher and Naphtali, they migrate south. I mean, we know nowadays in our modern worlds, when there's wars and conflicts, refugees. Again, the Assyrians, if you are conquering a land, you want people there, either as slaves, indentured servants, workers, loyal people, to work your land, to take care of the things that are there. You're not going to wipe out everybody and everything. So there are people who are still Israelites who live in this region. And of course, they start interacting more with these foreigners, these foreign gods, these foreign dignitaries and rulers, because they're now their rulers. They've lost their interaction with the southern tribes. But again, when we say that there is no more northern kingdom, does not mean that there's no more people of Ephraim or Manasseh or Dan or any of these tribes, because these people still exist. They're just not as isolated or identified as members of a specific tribe. And it's during this period, pre-exilic, pre-Assyrian conquest of the north, that you begin to lose the tribal identities. And again, we're not going to belay on that, but before this map was here, what were the people of Israel? What did they do before they conquered the land? They were wanderers. They were nomads. That's why the temple was in a tent. And I've said this before. That's why the temple was mobile. Because even if they had conquered this land, it's still centuries, at least 1 century. And again, I'd have to look and do a little more study, but there is years and years and years of separation between the founding of the land, or the conquest of the land. You have the judges, you have Saul, and you have David. Still no temple. So you have years and years of rule where this temple is still a tent of meeting. The tent is mobile. Each one we read in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, of the jobs of each of the tribes and how they are assigned different duties to carry the different portions of the tent wherever they go, because they go as a group. By this time, by 500 BCE, by the conquest and beginning of the exile, it is no longer so much dependent on the tribe. Like, I am a Manassan, I'm a Gadonite. These are Israelites. You lose these individual tribal identities because there's not a need as much for the individual tribal jobs. The Danites, they carry a certain portion of the tent. But now you have a solid, you have the temple itself. What is the need just to be able to carry those things? Because you're not carrying them anymore. You've provided that during the time that it was necessary. But now you have a solid, simple, it's not simple, but you have a solid, stable, non-movable temple that no longer requires the different tribes to carry the different portions or to be responsible for them. Because then you start developing where it is only the Levites and only the priests who are responsible for the objects in the temple. It's not the Manassans, it's not the Issacharites who are responsible for carrying these things. Those things move over to the temple. So when you get to the portion, to the exile, there is no longer any of these tribes, basically from Dan, Ephraim, Gad, Reuben, north. Those city-states, because each one of those has like a little capital. Hey, this is the capital of Reuben. This is the capital of Manasseh. They no longer have those portions. They've moved down to Judah and to Benjamin and to Simeon, and this is where they end up. So all this stuff north is gone. So you literally lose half, if not, 2/3 of your land. But even then, for the last 200 years, when you had two separate kingdoms, it wasn't their land. They were united by a belief. There's archaeological evidence that belief still hasn't fully developed into monotheism at this point. That's an archaeological perspective, because there's tons of like we talked previously, little house idols, town idols, and so forth. So they're still acknowledging, if not worshiping, but acknowledging these individual, not polytheistic, but sub-powerful, entities. They still recognize that there is one Adonai, but there's archaeological evidence throughout that, the interactions with all these other foreigners have continued to move on to this day. And again, I think that's part of why the writers of Jeremiah and the writers of Ezekiel and these great prophets warn the people of Israel consistently. You have failed. You continue to worship these idols. And again, why are they worshiping idols? And I know this is a terrible, I could not get it to blow up anymore. But if you look at the section, if you make out the section below is the kingdom of Judah. The section above is the kingdom of Israel. So you don't have the really pretty colorful stuff. From now on, moving forward, from 500 on, nothing to the north matters. So anything that's agricultural, anything that is any cattle or anything like that does not belong to the things that are talked about in the Bible, in the Old Testament. None of that matters, because none of that belongs to Israel anymore. None of that belongs to Judea or to Judah. See, this is a better picture. So we get all of that, and it collapses down to this, literally this section. Idumea is actually part of traditional Judah. Okay, it is part of the tribe of Judah. However, the leaders, and we'll talk about this a little bit more once we get into the development, the leaders of Judah don't have the authority to really control everything to the south. It is traditionally part of Judah, but it is not controlled by the leadership of Judah. It's actually controlled by, that's actually considered part of Egypt. And we'll talk about how that develops in the coming weeks. But Egypt is, again, is a big influence. And as I talked about, you can read it says province of Yehud, about 440 BC, part of the Persian satrapy. Satrapy, again, means colony, or, that's they control it. It's one of their territories. They have their own independent government, but that government is responsible to the Persians, and later the Greeks, the Macedonian Empire, and then it goes back to the Ptolemies in Egypt, and then they become independent for 200 years. So, as you can see, Jerusalem is the center of this. As I understand it, this region itself is only about 40 miles. So there's basically, from Jerusalem to Hazor is about 40 miles. From Jerusalem to Bethzur is about 40 miles. So roughly a 40-mile circle. So anything that we do have that is written, that we have as scripture in the Old Testament post-exile, this is what they know about. This is what the writers are talking about. They're not talking about Hebron, and we read about Hebron in the New Testament, and it's one of the places that Jesus visits. We learn about the Dead Sea and so forth, and we learn about Samaria, because that's actually up there. That's the Samaritans. But as you can see, Samaria is north of Jerusalem. And there was, as we've read before, we read in the New Testament, Samaritans and Jews didn't get along. There's archaeological evidence that Samaritans are actually related, not actual, but distant relations to members of the lost tribe, because they're from the northern area, the tribes that were conquered. So the God that they worship is the same God as we read in the New Testament. It's the same God. And the Samaritan woman tells Jesus, we worship the same God. You worship at the temple, they worship at the mountain. But it's the same God. There's evidence, again, that these people are directly related, or at least descended from some of the tribes. And that may be why the Jews don't like the Samaritans, because we don't have a lot of story or writings about why that animosity occurred. But it makes sense, at least from a non-scholarly perspective, that if we already didn't get along because Israel broke off and had their own kings and defied the line of David, so we don't like them anyways, the 10 tribes or the 9 tribes, however you want to say it, so we don't like them anyway. They're gone. They don't have a kingdom anymore. But they're still the same people, and they're not following the law. They're not coming to Jerusalem to worship. Okay, so you worship the same God we do, but you're not following his law. You're not coming to the temple for sacrifices. You're not coming to the temple for Passover. You don't come into Jerusalem and do the mandated requests for, the sin offerings as prescribed in the law of Moses. So there's a lot of historical animosity and historical disagreement between Samaritans and Judeans. And again, all of these people, it's like, anybody have relations living in any of the, 5 states that border Missouri? I grew up in Texas, so we have, we don't go outside our borders unless we're forced to. But so those of you who have relations outside of the state of Missouri, it's very much the same thing. These people are still related to each other. It's like Thanksgiving dinner with your cousin, your uncle who disagrees with you either politically or, whatever. That's this in a national perspective, in an international perspective. And again, at the end of the day, they're all under the control of the Persians at this point. So whatever they do is restricted by what the Persians don't want you to do and will allow you to do. So the Persians, they allow them to worship in Jerusalem. But the Assyrians didn't. That's when the Assyrians come in and they destroy Jerusalem. That was their proclamation. Proclamation is, nope, you're an Assyrian now, and now you're going to worship our God, and your God doesn't matter because we conquered you. But as we know by the prophets, that was going to happen, and it was going to be fulfilled that it was going to come back. It wasn't going to end. And we have that story. We have those messages, and you have those writings. But outside of Jerusalem, you have, at least from this map, you have, and these are major cities. And again, like I said, I don't have all the slides that I wanted to give everybody. But I was reading this week. On average, a large city or large town outside of Jerusalem in post-exilic Judea and in this region, the average size town is 4 hectares, which is approximately 12 acres, I believe. So we're talking Hebron, which we know is a bastion of military strength in the later half of the end of the Common Era. We read of Bethlehem. Bethlehem, at the time of Jesus, archaeological evidence points that Bethlehem was a city of about 180 people, 200 people, and had an area of approximately 4 acres, and that was the entire size of the city. It really was a village. And again, these are towns that are important to most of the people. And again, as we spoke before, Jerusalem was no more than 10 acres at the time that it was rebuilt. It grows a little bit more, and obviously now it's a city of like 2.5 million people. But the old city of David itself was remarkably small. It was really the Temple Mount and the king's house and some housing for the servants and those who service the temple and service the priests. The city of David itself outside is approximately another additional 4 to 6 acres. And that's where the people who, as we're going to talk about next, who work the land, who provide the water, who dig the pool of Siloam, who dig the tunnel underneath Jerusalem, that's where they live. So we're not talking about metropolitan areas. We're not talking about, these cities make Jefferson City look like New York City nowadays. I lived in Jeff City for 15 years, so it is remarkable how big how small these locations were. Because again, at the end of the day, we're talking about a worldwide population of maybe 500 million people at this time. So there's not a huge amount of people living in these areas. And it's surprising how small and not insignificant, but how small yet significant these places are. And majority of the people who are worshiping as Judeans, who are of Jewish descent, live in these small towns. They don't live in Jerusalem. That's, and they make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Let's see. All right. So this is not necessarily the best map, but it is a good, again, I couldn't blow it up yet. So the map of ancient Israel's natural features. So it's important to understand where Jerusalem is. So Jerusalem, you see the Dead Sea in the middle. Jerusalem is that black squiggly line that you can't even read, that is on the north side of the Dead Sea and to your left. That actually says Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in the hill country. And as we're going to see, there's three major features of the land of the area that we call Judea. Okay, you have the coastal plain, you have the hill country, and then you have literally the Trans-Indonian, and the words up there on the next slide, Trans-Indonian desert. So it's if you've ever been to the Southwest, if you've ever visited Arizona, like just driving through the middle of Arizona, that's very much what a good portion of Judea looks like. So what does that mean? That means that growing is very different than what we're used to here in Missouri and in the United States, in the sense that we're talking about an area the size of maybe New Jersey. If anybody's driven through New Jersey or been in New Jersey, that's about the size of Judea. It's actually a little bit smaller than New Jersey, but it's about that size. There are no cars. There are no bicycles. There's donkeys, wagons, and everybody's favorite, your feet. So if you're going to go somewhere, you're walking. Because again, donkeys aren't really meant for riding. They're meant for labor. So, to see somebody on a donkey, and I think this is something we don't grasp in reading the Gospels, is somebody riding on a donkey is a rare thing. Because either they are very privileged or they are infirm. So Mary riding the donkey, Mary rides the donkey because she's very pregnant and it's hard for her to walk. But anybody, and again, I see most of us are men, probably don't understand what it's like to be pregnant. We know what it's like to be with somebody who is pregnant, but we don't know what that's like. So I've been told by my wife, and I'm sure it's true, that it's probably not much more comfortable to be riding on a donkey, even if you're riding side saddle, when you're 9 months pregnant, than it would be to walk. So either way, she's having a really rough time. Jesus, on the other hand, fulfills the scripture because, again, there's very few people who ride donkeys or ride animals to begin with because it's just not a common thing. You're not using the animal, the pack animal, for human transport. You're using it to, if you're riding something, you're riding a wagon or a cart that's being pulled by a donkey or an ox, which we're going to talk about. But you can't really make this out, and I've got another map that is going to distinguish this. So you have the coastal plain up against the Mediterranean Sea. Anybody who's been, I grew up in San Antonio, anybody who's been to the coast, I have family down in Corpus Christi, you understand what that area is like. Very temperate, so there's not a lot of temperature swings. It's important to note that it does snow in the Middle East. It snows in Judea. But you don't get those wild temperature swings near the coastal plain. Then you have the hill country. If anybody grew up or visited the Texas hill country, the Ozarks, very similar to that. You can grow things, but the soil is not the easiest to work at all. We had an opportunity a couple of years ago to possibly buy land out in the Ozarks, and I was like, with what I wanted to do with it, just have my own garden and maybe an orchard or something. I don't have the ability, I don't have the skills, and I certainly don't have the time to work the land like it needs to be worked. And then you have, again, you see the Jordan Valley. It's kind of actually a very good place to be because It's in between. It's got a little bit different soil, but it's still considered part of the hill country area. And then you have to the west, you have the desert-like shrubs and so forth. So, like everything else, like our friends, the Egyptians, everything revolves around water in this area. Egypt, I was reading part of, in preparation, so Egypt is one of the largest countries that's organized at this time, but only 5% of the land is utilized because it's the only part of the land that's utilized, and it's all surrounding the Nile River. Here, it's very much the same thing. If you can find water, like the Pool of Siloam, if you can find water like the Dead Sea, even though the water there is not really favorable to growing and for plants, they do have distillation. That's actually something that's very that's knowledge that's known in the ancient world. So they're able to clean the water. It's just not easy to do, especially given what they have at the time. But there's a lot of places around springs and wadis, which are little lakes, little water locales in the area. These features dominate what can be grown and when it can be grown for the people of Judea. And again, poor map, but this actually does. And again, those of you who've just come in, I didn't really have time to get everything cleaned up, so this is a rough edit, and things will be cleaned up, and I'll have these slides again, these pictures up. But this is a map of the three distinct areas. So you have the water, you have the coastal plain to your right. Then in the middle, you have the hill country, and then to the left, you have the desert. And in between the hill country and the desert is the Jordan Valley. So that is the prime growing spot for Judea. So that's literally Jerusalem abuts that. It comes up next to it. You have things to the east where everything grows. You have things that are good for certain things to the west, because that's still decent growing area, agricultural area, but it's very much not like California, which is the United States' prime growing locale for things that are not just wheat or grasses, edible grasses. So what we eat, what the Jews eat, what they live on, what they survive on, is very limited. We read about Jesus feeding the 5,000 with fish and bread, and we think that makes sense. Tons of fish. That makes sense. Except it doesn't. Why? It's still 50, 60 miles to the coast. It's hard to get fish, fresh or saltwater fish. The freshwater fish either come from the Jordan River or areas north of the Dead Sea, between the Sea of Galilee, which is actually a very good freshwater locale. So you have great fishing, you have great access to fish up in the Sea of Galilee, because it's not salty like the Dead Sea. But it's still hard to get that food, those fishes, from the Sea of Galilee down to Jerusalem, because we don't have mass transportation. We don't have 18-wheelers, refrigerated trucks that can take the fish down. So what you're going to have is salted fish. If you're going to have fish in a locale that's closer to Jerusalem or further south or further away from the coast. So as we're going to talk about, what other fauna, what other things did Jews eat? One of the things that is fascinating, at least for me, was fascinating in reading up this week, and I'd known about this for a while, but just revisiting is the amount of wild boar remains that are found throughout Judea and Israel. There's a prohibition against eating pork. Eating pork or starving. Again, these are subsistence farmers. So if you don't know what subsistence farming is you farm to survive. You're on the brink of starvation. You're on the brink of not having enough nutrition. And again, these aren't people sitting in front of a computer all day who can go by with an English muffin or a biscuit and you're good until dinner. These are people, not just guys. These are people who are up and working and working and working. In the Middle Ages, in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, this is actually a very common product in the Middle East as well. Not so much in here, because one of the good things you can grow in the Middle East or in the Levant are grapes. So you get a lot of wine, but it's beer. Beer is liquid bread. And in the Middle Ages, and even before then, when the Egyptians, our oldest history of beer in this area, in the world, is approximately 10,000 BCE in Egypt. And actually, there was a project, a scientific project a couple of years ago where they found some remnant dried barley and beer, and they were able to analyze it, and they recreated Egyptian beer. And it's not like the beer that we think about today. It is very bitter, and there's no sugar. It doesn't have no sweetness, and again, there's no herbs or anything like that. But again, wine is a very important product. Because why? Because not only do we know that water wasn't very safe at this point in the world, but what do grapes have? Juice. So there's your water there. You don't have to add water to it. And we're not talking about, they're aging wine for years so that it gets the alcohol. They're not drinking wine. They're not drinking alcohol to get intoxicated. That's a byproduct. They're drinking this because it's got liquid in it, one. And the alcohol is a byproduct of making sure that you're safe. Because the alcohol is killing the bacteria that would have killed you. So, yes, there is drinking in excess. It is condemned in the Bible. But there is also there are multiple wine festivals that are held by the Jews and the Israelites pre-exile. Wine is a very important product, agricultural product in the Middle East and in the Levant at this point. But so you see the three main agricultural or climate areas of the Levant, of Judea. So you have the coastal plain, you have the hill country, and then you have the desert, Jordan desert area. And again, we'll talk about this more in detail next week once I start getting classes I can get these things organized. Here is a colored map. Generally shows the climate areas. So the yellow is Mediterranean, grape growing areas. Okay, we think of the Mediterranean topic, or Mediterranean area is very much like California. So if you look to the picture up north, up on top, that is that's a picture from the Mediterranean area of Judea. So good, you get a good amount of rain. You've got the ability to work the land and the soil itself. The purple area is the Irano-Tunisian steppe. This is the hill country. Again, very much like the Ozarks, very much like the hill country in Texas. It's okay, but the land is very hard to work. Doesn't mean that you can't work it, but we're not growing 500 different crops. There's a very limited handful of crops that can grow in here. And then in the, you can't really tell it, but the purplish and the brown to the west, or to the east, which is to my right, your left, that's the Sahara Arabian Desert. That starts to become the Arabian Desert area. Almost no growing. Very, very small shrubs, small plants, and so forth. Remarkably, that is not a bad spot for growing or for raising animals. It's just a bad spot for agriculture, for raising plants. This is a picture of the Judean foothills. A lot of what they depend on, and you can't really see it here because it's smaller, is water runoff. So you can kind of see in that bigger picture to your right, there's a kind of a line in the middle. That's actually water runoff after a rainstorm. It is coming down. Lots of trees. So these notes that I have off to the side. So what kind of plants are growing naturally? Not farmed, not planted, but natural. So you have wild olive trees. So olives obviously are an important part of the culture here. You have caramel woodlands, which are dominated by carob and lentistic trees. Almonds, very common. And then forest and woodlands. So prior to people moving in there and building homes and so forth, we have historical evidence or archaeological evidence of more forests and woodlands in the area. You have the major cereal crops that are grown for bread and other cereal needs are emmer wheat. And again, when I said I've got pictures, I do have pictures of what these plants look like. I'll have them next week so we can take a look at what people were eating. So you have emmer wheat, which is a type of wheat. It's a little bit different than the wheat we eat now. You have wild barley, which is actually very abundant. Barley was the dominant cereal crop in the area, and wild oats. So those are your three major cereal crops in the area. Bread becomes very important, but it's not the bread we know. It's very dry, very, if you ever had barley wheat, barley bread, it's coarse, it's hard to mill. Even when you mill it, it doesn't break down as well as wheat does. And it's not as digestible as our wheat is today. And then, again, almonds. Almonds are very important. It's not something we really think about. We don't really read about in the New Testament. Wasn't really familiar with that, but almonds are a very major crop, source of oil, source of fat and protein in the region. And then real quick, this might have been the last slide that I have. We got 1 minute. Fauna. So our big fauna in this area, our big animals, natural, not game animals, are the ibex, so a type of gazelle. Red deer are the two big ones. I just want to make sure. Okay. So those two, wild boar, as I mentioned before. Again, there's no fences. We don't have fences. We don't have barbed wire. So goats, lambs, and sheep. Those are the main, and most of these are wild. They are domesticated by this point. Obviously, domestication happens about 15,000 years before. But those are the major fauna of the area. And it is from these things that become necessary for worship, because they recognize and they identify that these things are blessings from God. And they use them in their worship, the grains and the animals. And there's all sorts of birds. I didn't really get into any, like doves and so forth, that are native to the area as well. Again, next week we'll have a better, more in-depth class. We'll talk about the fauna and the flora a little bit more, and then we'll go forward from there. Any questions? Thank you all.